I've been inspired by how eager people are to discuss our founding principles.
From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush in New York City.
I've been traveling around the country speaking to rural and urban communities, red and blue America, and people are very devoted to the ideals of the Declaration and the Constitution: liberty, equality, government by consent, federalism, the separation of powers, the Bill of Rights. There is a hunger for civil dialogue, an eagerness to really dig deep into history with all of its complexities, and a devotion to the principles of the Constitution and the Declaration.
As we celebrate July 4th and observe the United States' 250th signing of the Declaration of Independence, I want to spend some time with our founding documents and where the tensions of our founders might be getting lost in all the rhetoric, particularly around issues of religious freedom in our democracy. So this week, I'll be talking with Professor Jeffrey Rosen of George Washington University and the National Constitution Center. And make sure you listen to the end of the show because Professor Rosen gives a really beautiful opportunity how we can all observe July 4th in this 250th year. We need voices like Jeff Rosen's to be heard now more than ever. So please make sure you subscribe, share, and rate The State of Belief on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast platform. Taking a minute to do these things really helps other people discover our show and become listeners too. Our library of past conversations includes almost 200 hopeful, empowering, inspiring interviews with guests like Jeff Sharlet, Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum, Skye Perryman, John Fugelsang, and many others. You can help us grow The State of Belief with a financial contribution today. Find out how at stateofbelief.com, and you can support and join the work of Interfaith Alliance at interfaithalliance.org. Before we get to our conversation with Jeffrey Rosen, I want to just say happy 4th of July to all of you, and let's keep in our minds that tension between what July 4th promises and what it has delivered and how it has fallen short for so many Americans, and yet what the promise still can be if we're committed to it. The tension between Juneteenth and then July 4th is always that there was liberation and yet the promise of full equality, full freedom for everyone, that really delivering on this idea that all people are created equal, people of all genders, people of all levels of economic status, people of all racial backgrounds and all different identities, that we should be free and able to live together in our democracy. That's the promise that is inherent in the Declaration of Independence. So as we listen to our guest today and as we think about the words of the July 4th Declaration and also the Constitution, let's pledge ourselves to make sure that we continue to move forward to fulfill the project that is America, and that we are constantly imagining a greater state of the union for all of us. And now to my guest. Jeffrey Rosen is CEO Emeritus of the National Constitution Center. He is also a professor of law at the George Washington University Law School and a contributing editor of The Atlantic. He was previously the legal affairs editor of The New Republic and a staff writer for The New Yorker. Jeffrey Rosen's new book, Pursuit of Liberty: How Hamilton versus Jefferson Ignited the Lasting Battle Over Power in America. That was published in October of 2025. His other books include New York Times bestseller, The Pursuit of Happiness: How Classical Writers on Virtue Inspired the Lives of the Founders and Defined America, and Conversations with RBG, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg on Life, Love, Liberty, and Law, as well as biographies of Louis Brandeis and William Howard Taft. What a great list of books. I just want to, can we just download them into my brain? Those are amazing books. Welcome to the show, Professor Rosen.
It is wonderful to be here, and wonderful to be here with Justice Brandeis looking over us and making sure that we are industrious and faithful to the principles of the Constitution.
I love that. Well, this is the way we met, is that you wrote a very, very good book on Justice Brandeis as part of the Yale series of books on Jewish Americans. And we got a chance to speak about that book and about all your wisdom about Brandeis several years ago. And I followed your work, and I just find you one of the keenest minds in America.
Hardly.
And so here we are. We are, we're turning 250, as a nation with the Declaration of Independence. And we're in kind of a moment where it's a lot of questions about identity, about who we are, about, a lot of it actually, like, really looking at the books you've written, focusing on, like, what did our founders really mean? And how beholden are we to what they thought versus how the country has evolved? So I just think you're totally the right person to be talking to right now. Why don't we just start off by, like, how are you feeling about America right now, and the way that our kind of collective conversation about our founding and where we are 250 years later?
Well, I've been inspired by how eager people are to discuss our founding principles. I've been traveling around the country speaking to rural and urban communities, red and blue America, and people are very devoted to the ideals of the Declaration and the Constitution: liberty, equality, government by consent, federalism, the separation of powers, the Bill of Rights. Of course, people disagree about how to balance those values, and we are more polarized than at any time since the Civil War. But despite all that, there is a hunger for civil dialogue, an eagerness to really dig deep into history with all of its complexities, and a devotion to the principles of the Constitution and the Declaration.
I love that. That is a very positive message. And I do think that, I think people are invested in the question of America. But it has implications. How we answer that question has different implications for different people. And, I think one of the things that, I say a lot because of my work in religion and democracy is that one of the things that the founders got most right was the non-establishment clause and the freedom to follow our own conscience and practice religion in whatever way we wish, but that the state would not establish any sort of religion. And I wonder if you can give some of your context around that, like how they came to that decision, which was such a radical idea. It really was not like, oh yeah, we'll do what everybody else does and say non-establishment clause in our that was a new big idea for the world. So maybe you can give a little background for how that got into the Constitution.
Absolutely. Freedom of conscience was the central value that, at least for James Madison, the Constitution was designed to protect. And we get a sense of what Madison and Jefferson thought about it in Jefferson's Virginia Bill of Rights and Religious Freedom, which he drafted right before he finished the Declaration of Independence. So in Virginia at the time, the Anglican Church is established. Presbyterians and Baptists can be arrested for preaching their faith. Jews and other dissenters can be denied the freedom to marry. So Jefferson and Madison want not only to disestablish the Anglican Church and remove compulsory tithings and punishment for dissent, but to prohibit all compelled support for religion. And Jefferson, in the Virginia Bill of Religious Freedom, sets out 4 reasons why government can make no law that constrains freedom of speech and religion. And here they are. First, freedom of conscience is an unalienable right because people can only think for themselves. What does it mean to be an unalienable right? Jefferson says, well aware that the opinions and beliefs of men depend not only on their own will, but follow involuntarily the evidence proposed to their minds. God hath created the mind free and manifested his supreme will, that free it shall be remain by making it altogether insusceptible of restraint. In other words, I can't give you the power to control my thoughts because my thoughts are the product of reason and persuasion, not force or violence. That's a radical transformation from the medieval view, which is that truth comes from the king or the pope or the authority, to this Enlightenment faith that human beings can discern reason for themselves. And Madison also sums that up in his Memorial and Remonstrance, where he says, rights of conscience are unalienable because the opinions of men, depending only on evidence contemplated by their own minds, cannot follow the dictates of other men.
That is like, I just want to pause there.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just the first one.
Yeah.
But that's so radical. It's so radical because it really does say, like, actually each person has that power, that ability to do that, which was like a very, we still have this idea of, oh, they're the thinkers, they're the, but actually everyone is afforded that right. And I think that's like, it's so important. It also is a big responsibility that it's on us, that if you want to be, a part of this society that we're building, we need you to also participate with your own mind.
That is a crucial point. It's not only a right, but it's also a responsibility or a duty, as the founders would say.
Yeah.
And the whole premise of the Enlightenment is that citizens have to consider competing points of view in order to make up their own minds. And that's why Jefferson says that truth has nothing to fear from error as long as reason is free to combat it. He's getting that from John Milton in Areopagitica. And the idea is it's important and necessary to allow people to express even false ideas about religion or politics, because it's only in the competitive marketplace of ideas, as Holmes would call it, or the commerce of ideas, as Madison called it, that people can agree about the truth. The founders distinguished between two kinds of truth: self-evident truths and matters of fact. And they get this from David Hume. Self-evident truths are like 2 + 2 = 4, a mathematical axiom that you can discern by reason. Matters of fact, though, are open to debate, and that includes what's the true religion. And that's why even false religion had to be admitted into the public square so people can make up their own minds.
This is, it feels so important. And, it reminds me of the saying in Islam, like, there can be no compulsion in religion. And I feel like that's true in every religion, that if you're compelled to believe it, that's not true faith. And I think that's where this also, like, one of the great, the great benefits of this effort, and I know you've just kind of started to get into it, but the great benefits of the freedom of conscience that we were afforded is that it not only helps the country maintain space for everyone, but it also helps faith thrive because it's this marketplace of ideas, and I love the fact that Jefferson even listed many different faith traditions. He says all of them can be in this marketplace, including like pagan and things that were not Christian, certainly. And so I just think that these are. In some ways it does. I hate to like bring it back to Brandeis, but a lot of this reminds me of like the kind of Brandeisian ideals of like the importance of people making their own decisions and being free to live their lives as their conscience tell them.
Well, there's a good reason that this reminds you of Brandeis, because Brandeis read Jefferson's bill on religious freedom in the summer of 1926, right before he drafted the greatest free speech opinion of the 20th century.
That's what I was thinking. I was literally thinking about, is that Whitney? Or no, I mean...
It's Whitney, and Brandeis literally is going through Jefferson's 4 reasons and then paraphrasing them in a kind of constitutional poetry. But he is a Jeffersonian to his core.
Yes.
And Whitney is a summary of the Jeffersonian reasons for protecting free speech.
Yeah. Isn't that... Well, we're getting a little like nerdy here, but
well, this is constitutional nerdiness is necessary.
It is super constitutional nerdiness. So this is a July 4th treat. But I do think like it's worth remembering the brilliance of a lot of this. And we definitely, we want to make sure that, in the context of this, The intentional abdication of duty around the enslaved people who also deserve every bit of this freedom of conscience and freedom general. But it is important to recognize that the germs of these ideas of freedom are so important. Let me go from like the sublime to one of the big questions that I think a lot of us are fighting right now, frankly. I mean, when you read all of this, and then you hear the claims, we're a Christian nation. How do you square those things? Because we could go so deep into all of this, but when we pull it back into our 250th year, which we are, and this July 4th weekend, there's some big questions at stake that have to do with how we're going to understand the identity of the nation, who actually belongs, who actually can benefit from that identity. How do you go from this subtlety that you were talking about, to that kind of, I don't want to call it crass, but I want to call it like reductionist, maybe, a conversation about like, are we a Christian nation?
Well, the first thing is to say that the founders disagree about that question. We've been talking about Jefferson and Madison, who were the most libertarian on free speech and freedom of religion. But contrast that with the Puritan theocrat, Roger Sherman, who in the Constitutional Convention opposes the appointment of Gouverneur Morris to France because he says he's a heretic. And in Connecticut at the time, the Congregationalist Church punishes blasphemers and compels taxes. And establishments in the states don't really fall out of the picture until the early 19th century. And when the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, one of its central purposes, in addition to preventing the a federal establishment, is to prevent the federal government from disestablishing state churches like Congregationalism or Anglicanism. So it wasn't until the 20th century that the Establishment Clause is applied to the states and prohibits either the states or the federal government from establishing a religion. That said, the claim that we are a Christian nation is directly contradicted by the final words of the First Amendment, which Madison interpreted to say the state must be non-cognizant of religion. That was his phrase. It can neither support or discourage it, but it must allow all religions access to the public sphere. It can't set up one as better than the others that everyone has to pay tribute to. That's what the Establishment Clause says. And the Free Exercise Clause says that no one can be forced to take any position in matters of belief because truth is great, as Jefferson said, and will prevail if left for herself. She is the proper and sufficient antagonist to error. So all this is to say that some people at the founding thought we were not only a Christian nation, but should be able to establish particular versions of Christianity in their states. But the Establishment Clause repudiated that first for the federal government, and then that was applied to the states. And given the First Amendment as it now stands, it can't be said that any religion defines America.
Yeah, I think that, thank you for saying that. And I think, what I like, your background coming from the Constitution Center, and that's, you're an even-handed fellow. You really have thought about this, and I think it's so important that we recognize that yes, there were people at the founding who were devout Christian, but part of the genius was, and what of the Constitution was, that you could be as different as an Anglican Christian and a Puritan Christian, or Roger Williams, who was like a Baptist, and you could, those things were about as different as some Jews and Christians are today. I mean, they were not like, okay, well, we're hey cousin. Like, these were thought of as completely could not be side by side, and yet the way they could be side by side was the non-establishment clause, and I just think that is like important to remember right now, is that it allowed people from different backgrounds to actually live side by side while disagreeing on some fundamental things and believing that the truth will eventually come to pass, and that's I think. The idea, that's the reason I think going back to Whitney and the freedom of speech is that, like, let the truth, let people speak. And then eventually the truth will be discerned rather than silencing speech. And so I'm interested for you in how you see the connection between freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, and freedom of speech, because those two things are also right now, in some ways threatened.
Absolutely. Freedom of speech and freedom of conscience are inextricably combined. And we understand that from Jefferson's other three reasons, which Brandeis so beautifully channels. Jefferson says, in addition to being an unalienable right, free speech and freedom of conscience make representatives accountable to we the people. You have to be able to criticize public officials as well as religious leaders, because human beings are fallible and uninspired, and they'll always try to impose their own opinions and modes of thinking on others. Next, Jefferson says free speech is necessary for the discovery and spread of political and religious truth. So unless you have access to the different opinions in politics and religion, the truth won't emerge. And finally, free speech allows the public discussion, which is necessary for democratic self-government. People can't decide how to structure society unless everyone has the opportunity to contribute to the marketplace of ideas. And I have to say, Justice Brandeis summed that up into what I think is the most inspired paragraph ever written about free speech. As a party trick, I've memorized it, and I don't have to do it now, but
do it. I certainly do not have that party trick. I'm eager to hear it.
This is just constitutional poetry, and listen closely to each word. Brandeis says in Whitney, those who won our independence believed that the final end of the state was to make men free to develop their faculties, and that in its government, the deliberative forces should prevail over the arbitrary. They valued liberty both as an end and as a means. They believed liberty to be the secret of happiness and courage to be the secret of liberty. That's a quotation from Pericles' funeral oration. They believed that freedom to think as you will and speak as you think, that's a quotation from Tacitus, are means indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth, that without free speech and assembly, discussion would be futile, that with them, discussion affords ordinarily adequate protection against the dissemination of noxious doctrine, that the greatest menace to freedom is an inert people, that public discussion is a political duty, and that this should be a fundamental principle of the American government. Wow, isn't that extraordinary?
I mean, very, very, very good. He was a smarty pants, wasn't he?
He was. Not only was he a smarty pants, but he had a unique ability to translate the principles of the founding into a modern age in a kind of constitutional poetry. It's a gift that Jefferson had as well, but he's distilling these basic principles, and he's showing how they apply in a world very different than the 18th century. He starts off by saying fear of serious injury alone can't justify suppression of speech and assembly. Men feared witches and burnt women. He's referring to the Salem witch trials. But it's the function of free speech to free men from the bondage of irrational fears.
Wow.
And then he comes up with the test for when you're allowed to suppress free speech or freedom of conscience. And he says, to justify suppression of free speech, there must be reasonable grounds to fear that serious evil will result if free speech is practiced, and there must be reasonable ground to believe that the danger apprehended is imminent. So this is not that's the American test for free speech. It comes from Brandeis, who's getting it from Jefferson. In other words, you can only ban speech if it's intended to and likely to cause imminent and serious injury.
Right.
And that is the most speech protective test in the world. And
was Whitney a dissent, or was that actually?
It was a concurrence, and it's kind of weird that it was a concurrence because he disagreed with the outcome. It was for technical reasons. It was a concurrence, but it involved Anita Whitney, who's literally being prosecuted under this California anti-communism law,
Right.
simply for getting up at a Communist Party meeting and objecting to lynching, actually. She was objecting to racist violence, and she was prosecuted for that. And Justice Brandeis thought that her prosecution didn't meet this test.
Up next, more with Professor Rosen. You are going to want to keep listening for his understanding of what freedom of conscience really means for America. You can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. You'll also find links to topics we discussed this week, as well as transcripts and more. You can tell Alexa, Gemini, and Siri to play the podcast, The State of Belief, on any enabled device. Make sure you subscribe, share, and rate The State of Belief on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast platform. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. Welcome back to The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush. My guest is constitutional scholar Jeffrey Rosen, a professor of law at George Washington University. One of the things that I quote pretty much every time I talk about, kind of the history of freedom of religion in America is George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Truro, and it is, it's one of those things like if I was better at party tricks, I would have it. But one of the you probably can quote it verbatim. But one of my favorite parts of it is like we no longer speak about tolerance. I think that's such an important idea. Like it's one thing to tolerate people of other beliefs as if, and he says this, as if you have the power to bestow upon them tolerance. Whereas, Washington is saying no one has that power over any other person in America, a citizen in America. So I'm sure that you, and being a person from Jewish background, that feels to me so important to bring up in every conversation. Like we can no longer speak about tolerance of people saying, oh, I tolerate you being in my town. I tolerate you being a part of America. We just can't do that when it comes to religious freedom.
Absolutely not. You're right that that's a sacred text. This is not a party trick. I'm now reading it from the text. But it's now no more that toleration is spoken of, Washington says, as if it were the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights.
Yes.
For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. It's a move from the idea of toleration, which John Locke introduced in his letter concerning toleration, to the idea that freedom of conscience is a natural right that can't be controlled even if people want to allow government to control it. They can't, because our thoughts are the product of reason and persuasion, not force or violence. And then Hamilton says in Federalist 1 that the whole American experiment is a test of whether it's possible to construct a republic on reason and conviction rather than force or violence. It's never been tried before, and it's based on this inspiring Enlightenment faith of the illimitable freedom of the human mind and the necessity of government to protect religious minorities and political minorities from persecution.
Yeah. I do want to go back to the question of like all of this really beautiful, ideas, so important. And yet, how can you explain the discordant spiritual failing of recognizing how slavery is completely contradictory to all of this? And I'm sure that you at the Constitution Center have really thought about this. Like, as Frederick Douglass, I think, said, like, what is the 4th of July to me? And, we have these incredible ideas, and yet they just could not. They somehow could not bring themselves to apply it to the millions of enslaved people who were in the same, occupying the same space as they were.
Well, one thing that's striking is that in the founding generation, unlike the generation that came after, people did not try to claim that slavery was consistent with the Bible or natural law or the Declaration of Independence. And in fact, there's a really revealing speech from Patrick Henry. After he gives his "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, he says, "Is it not amazing that I myself, who believe that slavery violates the Bible and natural law, myself own slaves? I won't justify it. I won't attempt to. It's simple avarice or greed I can't do with the inconvenience of living without it." In other words, they recognized that it was wicked and immoral, but they liked the lifestyle and didn't want to give it up. I mean, that was the cold, horrific truth. And even Jefferson said, "I tremble for my country when I recall that God is just," because he too believed that slavery was inconsistent with the ideals of the Declaration. But of course, he refused to free even his own enslaved population, except his own kids with Sally Hemings, because he promised her he would when they were in Paris. So he was deeply hypocritical on the question, but he did not try to defend it. Now, the next generation is striking because some, like John Calhoun, started saying that the Declaration was a self-evident lie and that slavery was a positive good. They did deny that slavery should be abolished. But then you have the inspiring John Quincy Adams, one of my favorite of all the founders. And he, after he loses the presidential election and his oldest son commits suicide right after 1828 because he's an alcoholic and has a tragic death, Quincy Adams has dark nights of the soul. He reads the Bible every morning and he finds a passage where Jesus promises to free the captives. And Adams concludes from this that slavery must be abolished as a prophecy of the Bible itself. And then he runs for Congress and he becomes the greatest abolitionist of his age. He introduces constitutional amendments to end slavery. He denounces the gag rule, which forbade the reading of abolitionist petitions on the floor of Congress. And he dies after voting against the Mexican War. And on the floor of Congress, his final words are, "I am composed," which he gets from Cicero, who he read for moral inspiration and insisted that the self-composed and virtuous man was the happy man. It's just completely inspiring. And it was Adams who saw the connection between the Bible and the wickedness of slavery and also the necessity of protecting free speech in order to object to slavery.
So take me through like that how American jurisprudence dealt with this hypocrisy that's kind of inherent in our founding documents. And we just had a ruling about the Voting Rights Act. Could you just play that forward? Because it then continues all the way through the Civil War, but then after the Civil War, I mean, how does it eventually, not until literally centuries later, do we find that the that the Constitution in some ways catches up with itself?
Well, it's a long and painful story. After the Civil War, the Congress passes the three amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, that end slavery, guarantee equal protection of the laws and due process of laws to all, and give African-American men voting rights. And then based on those amendments, Congress passes the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which forbids racial discrimination in public accommodations. And tragically, the Supreme Court strikes that act down on grounds of federalism, the claim that Congress didn't have the power to pass it. The only dissenter is Justice John Marshall Harlan, who predicts that one day this decision will be as infamous as the Dred Scott decision, which the post-Civil War amendments were meant to overturn, when Dred Scott said that black people had no rights that white people were meant to respect. The 14th Amendment repudiates that by making all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to its jurisdiction citizens. So each of the amendments is designed to overturn Dred Scott. The Supreme Court ignores that. It's actually a great story. Harlan has writer's block, and he doesn't know what to say in his dissent. His wife finds Roger Taney's inkwell with which he wrote the Dred Scott decision and puts it on his desk. And when Harlan sees Taney's inkwell, he's filled with divine inspiration, and he wants to efface Taney's legacy with Taney's own pen, and he writes that dissent. And then Thurgood Marshall reads that dissent to inspire himself, along with Harlan's dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson, before he argues Brown versus Board of Education.
Wow.
And then, of course, it takes more than a century for Brown to strike down segregation, and then the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to repeat the rights that Black people should have been given a century earlier.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, and you mentioned the Black men getting rights, but then Black women and women in general. So it's I don't want to belabor the fact, but I do think it's interesting that the Constitution, and this is where I want to say two things at once. I think recognizing that gender equality was also something. I think I remember John Adams' wife saying what about us? But also that the question of, and this is really an interesting question to me always, because I think it applies so equally in some ways to the Constitution and to the Bible, is do we have living documents, the living Constitution, or do we have, what do they call it? When they say it meant what it meant when it meant it.
Original understanding.
Originalism, yeah. You could say kind of a fundamentalism in biblical terms. For me, it's so clear that it has to be living, otherwise it's dead, or it feels less and less meaningful. If it's not living, if it can't constantly be continued. But curious how, here we are in 2026, how should we understand the Constitution? How should we understand the Declaration of Independence? How should we understand this founding as we look back? It feels like it has to be organic, and we have to keep learning from it so that we can move forward. I tip my hand, but why don't you tell me how you understand that?
Well, we started off by saying that people have to think for themselves. No one can assert that there's one way to understand the Constitution. And it turns out that since the very beginning, people have disagreed about that very question. And Hamilton versus Jefferson, whose initial debates over national power versus states' rights, democracy versus rule by elites, and liberal versus strict construction of the Constitution have defined the debates ever since, disagreed on that precise question. Their disagreement was not entirely between originalism and living constitutionalism, but liberal and strict construction. And Jefferson said, you have to construe the word so strictly that unless a particular power is explicitly enumerated, you can't imply it, which is why he wanted to strike down the Bank of the United States, and also the Missouri Compromise. And Hamilton disagrees and says the Constitution is it's a constitution we're expanding. He called it liberal construction. He did believe that it should grow in response to pragmatic needs. And he thought that as long as the end be legitimate, then any means that were appropriate or conducive to achieving it could be implied. And he wanted to imply the power to charter a bank. And that's been the central dispute on the Supreme Court ever since. In the debates over the Civil Rights Act in 1875 and 1964, in the debates over healthcare reform, and even in the debates over the Voting Rights Act, it's really, should we construe the Constitution strictly so that its text only limits how far the document can be applied, or should it be construed liberally in the spirit of what the founders were trying to achieve? People have disagreed with that since the beginning. They disagree about it on the Supreme Court today, and people have to make up their own mind about what approach they find most persuasive.
I'll say that I was just with, I'm going to keep this vague because I don't want to implicate anybody, but I was just at one of the detention centers that are holding migrants and immigrants and people, our communities and our neighbors. And a friend of mine, a clergy person, decided they had visiting rights, that they were going to bring with them copies of the Constitution in Spanish, so that the people in the prisons, in these detention centers, would be able to imagine their minds freed, even if they could not free themselves. And I think that's like a testimony to the power, that the ongoing power of the Constitution in this moment and how we might be viewing this moment for our country. Why don't you just, we're coming towards the end. I'm curious how would you like the American people, how would you like our listeners to be thinking about, I know this is particularly about the Declaration of Independence, but it's of a piece like of our founding documents, our founding, in this moment when we are looking back in order to hopefully move forward. What's some advice that you would give all of us?
Read, study, learn, make up your own mind. Your moving account of bringing the Constitution into prisons so that the people's mind can be free reminds me of that incredible time when Frederick Douglass feels the most enslaved. It's not only when his body is in chains, but when his wicked master forbids his mistress from teaching him how to read. And when Douglass realizes that they're trying to control his mind, he goes onto the streets of Baltimore and buys reading lessons with bread from these boys who are hanging out on the street. And then he buys with bread this book called The Columbian Orator, which includes an essay on slavery, a dialogue on slavery where a slave argues for his freedom. And that inspires Douglass to become the greatest abolitionist, of course, of his time. And after the war, his big message is self-reliance, self-determination, and the necessity of education, of every individual going to the primary sources, looking at competing points of view, and making up their own mind. History is so exciting to study. The more you learn, the more you realize how little you learn. It's complex. It's sometimes tragic. But what's inspiring about the American idea, first, is that we are a creedal nation. We're defined by an idea, not by our race or color or religion. All you have to do is accept the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution to be an American, and the fact that we've debated them from the beginning. Debate is not a bug in the system, it's a feature, and the fact that Hamilton and Jefferson's initial debates have been carried through to today is what's prevented us from descending into violence. I love the fact that after Hamilton dies in the duel, Jefferson places a bust of him across from his own in Monticello. You can see it there today. And when he passes Hamilton's bust and he's old, he would smile faintly and say, "Opposed in life as in death." For Jefferson, Hamilton is not a hated enemy to be destroyed, but a respected opponent to be engaged with. And that is the spirit that we've got to get back to today.
Jeffrey Rosen is a professor of law at George Washington University. He is also CEO Emeritus of the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia and the author of so many good books. Jeff, I really appreciate you joining us here today on The State of Belief, and happy 4th of July.
Happy 4th of July. Happy 250th.
Before we go, I want to make sure that you know about our training platform, because everyone right now has something to learn about how to show up for our democracy. Interfaith Alliance is dedicated to training as many people as possible in 2026. We've already trained close to 30,000 people, and you could be next. And a lot of our trainings are asynchronistic, meaning they are available when you are available. Please go to interfaithalliance.org/training to see all of the different kinds of trainings that you can do. I even did one of them, which was for how to talk to the media about what you're doing. If you're going out and showing up and holding up signs and letting your opinion be known, you can learn how to let the media know and how they can tell your story to help amplify anything you are doing. So again, go to interfaithalliance.org/training to see all the trainings that are available to you. And we want to make sure that you feel trained up, prepared, and fully able to show up in the way you need to and the way our democracy needs you to do it. Who do you know who would get a lot out of hearing this beautiful conversation with Jeffrey Rosen? Please share The State of Belief with them, and be sure to subscribe to The State of Belief on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast platform. We need your help to continue growing The State of Belief, so please make a financial contribution today at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Raushenbush on The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.